The attack came without warning. One day in early December, American sailors looked to the sky in terror as enemy aircraft came screaming down towards them. As bombs rained down and exploded all around them, the sailors scrambled to their guns and fired desperately at the dive-bombing aircraft, which swooped so low the gunners could see the pilots' faces, along with the bright red disc painted on its wings. After barely 30 minutes, it was all over, with 4 sailors and passengers dead, 48 wounded, and the vessel beginning to sink. And so it was the commander gave the order to abandon ship. If you think you've heard this story already, think again, for this scene did not play out on December 7th, 1941, but on December 12th, 1937, and this action took place not in the sleepy tropical paradise of Hawaii, but on the turbulent, muddy waters of China's Yangtze River during a conflict all but forgotten today. This is the story of the USS Panay incident, the surprise Japanese attack that almost dragged America into the war 4 years earlier. The USS Panay was the lead vessel of the Panay class, a family of river gunboats specially designed for service on the Yangtze and its tributaries. Western gunboats had been a constant presence on Chinese rivers since the Opium Wars of 1839 and 1856, when the British forced the Chinese to sign a series of so-called unequal treaties opening the country to foreign trade. Businessmen and missionaries from all around the world flooded into China's interior, with dozens of trading ports, settlements, and missions popping up all along the coast and the banks of the Yangtze. But as the power of the ruling Qin dynasty began to crumble, these foreign settlements came under increasing threat from banditry and piracy. In response, the British, followed by other nations, introduced a policy of gunboat diplomacy, running regular naval patrols along the river to protect their economic interests. While the first American gunboats appeared on the Yangtze just after the American Civil War, the U.S. Navy did not truly make its presence felt at China until the Boxer Rebellion of 1899 to 1901, a mass anti-colonial rebellion which was ultimately quelled by an alliance of 7 Western imperial powers and Japan. Thereafter, the U.S. Navy maintained a small fleet of gunboats called the Yangtze Patrol, which protected American expatriates during the 1911 Chinese Revolution, the warlord era of 1916 to 1927, and the re-establishment of the Republic of China in 1928. By the mid-1930s, the fleet numbered 6 vessels, designed as they were for use on shallow rivers against local bandits and pirates, with the Panay sporting a 3-inch quick-firing cannon on her bow and stern, as well as 8 30-caliber Lewis machine guns on her upper superstructure for defense against small boats and aircraft. By the mid-1930s, however, the situation in southern China had calmed down significantly, and while the nationalist government of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek continued to fight the communist forces of Mao Zedong in the north, service on the Yangtze Patrol became a leisurely and highly coveted posting for U.S. sailors. With little in terms of action to deal with, life aboard a China River gunboat consisted largely of endless banquets and sports competitions with crews from other countries' gunboats, as well as keeping the ship clean and tidy to show the flag. Thankfully, much of the menial labor on board, from scrubbing the deck to cooking meals to laundering uniforms, was performed by a large contingent of local Chinese laborers. And while pay was low, it went far in China, meaning that sailors on shore leave were seldom short of cash to spend in the bars, theaters, and brothels of Shanghai. But this charmed life came to an abrupt end in 1937 with the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War. The Empire of Japan had long had territorial ambitions in mainland Asia, and over the last 30 years had annexed an increasing amount of territory, including Taiwan and the Penghu Islands in 1895, parts of the East Coast in 1905, Korea in 1910, the former German colony of Tsingtao in 1914, and Manchuria in 1931. Then, following a skirmish between Chinese and Japanese forces at the Marco Polo Bridge near Peking on July 7, 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China, landing troops in Shanghai on August 13th. Though the Japanese expected a quick and easy victory, the Chinese defenders put up a fierce resistance, and the Battle of Shanghai dragged out into a 3-month house-to-house slogging match through the ruins of the city, inflicting over 18,000 casualties on the Japanese side. While Shanghai ultimately fell on November the 26th, these heavy losses shocked and demoralized the Japanese troops, who had been indoctrinated with notions of cultural and military superiority over the Chinese. It was a blow which was to have horrific consequences. Throughout the Battle of Shanghai, Japanese forces were careful to avoid damaging neutral ships and properties in the city's foreign-controlled international settlement, though accidents inevitably occurred. For example, on August the 20th, a stray Japanese shell struck the cruiser USS Augusta, which was the flagship of the U.S. Navy Asiatic Fleet, killing 1 sailor and wounding 18. This prompted a stern protest from Admiral Harry Yarnell, commander-in-chief of the fleet, who demanded that the Japanese reposition their ships, a request the Japanese duly granted. Yet in spite of these concessions, it soon became clear that the thousands of U.S. servicemen and civilians in China were in ever-growing danger of becoming caught in the crossfire. In an attempt to mitigate the risk, on August the 10th, U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull had issued a directive to the Yangtze River Patrol emphasizing that, to quote, U.S. forces in China are in no sense expeditionary forces. They are not in occupation of an enemy territory, nor are they defending territory of the United States. They are expected to protect lives, but they are not expected to hold positions regardless of hazards. They would be expected to repel threatened incursions of mobs or of disorganized or unauthorized soldiery, but they would not be expected to hold a position against armed forces of another country acting on express high authority. As a further measure, Hull also urged the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs to instruct Japanese forces to refrain from attacks upon defenseless cities, hospitals, trains, and motor cars, etc. But Hull was pessimistic about the odds of avoiding collateral damage, later writing, "Sooner or later, some incident is going to happen resulting in the death or injury of American citizens going about their legitimate occupations within the interior of China where such dangers should not exist." Unfortunately, he was soon to be proven horribly correct. On December the 9th, Japanese forces reached the outer defensive line around Nanking and began mercilessly bombarding the city with artillery and ground attack aircraft. By this time, most of Nanking's American residents had already fled the city, with only a handful of embassy workers and journalists remaining behind. Then, on December the 11th, these stragglers finally abandoned their offices and boarded the Panay, bringing the ship's total complement to 5 officers, including Commander James Hughes and Executive Officer Lieutenant Arthur Anders, 54 enlisted men, 4 U.S. Embassy staff, including Senior Diplomatic Officer George Atchison, and 10 civilians. Among the civilians were 6 journalists: Norman Alley of Universal Newsreel, Eric Mayel of Movietone News, Norman Sung of the New York Times, Jim Marshall of Collier's Weekly, and Sandro Sandri and Luigi Barzini of the Italian newspapers La Stampa and Corriere della Sera. This brings us to the morning of December the 12th, 1937, when the Panay was moored 43 kilometers upstream of Nanking, along with 3 Standard Oil Company tankers, the Meiping, Meiyan, and the Meijia, preparing to lead the small civilian convoy downstream to Shanghai. Despite Panay's crew informing Japanese forces of their identity and mission and lashing large American flags onto the deck, Japanese artillery continued to target the flotilla, forcing them to move ever further upriver. Further, that morning, Panay received word that 4 British Insect-class gunboats, the HMS Ladybird, Bee, Cricket, and Scarab, had come under attack from Japanese aircraft, resulting in 1 sailor killed and 4 wounded. Meanwhile, Panay came once again under fire from the distant artillery and moved yet further upstream, where she was signaled by a Japanese army unit on the shore. Japanese soldiers then approached Panay in an armed motorboat and boarded her, demanding to know their purpose for being on the river and the disposition of Chinese forces in Nanking. Incensed, Commander Hughes curtly responded, "This is an American naval vessel. The United States is friendly to Japan and China alike. We do not give military information to either side." At this, the Japanese soldiers departed without incident. But if Hughes thought he and his crew were out of danger, he was to be proven spectacularly incorrect. For at around 1:30 that afternoon, the shapes of 3 aircraft appeared overhead, and as they began diving towards the Panay, Commander Hughes realized he was under attack. At less than 1,000 feet, the 3 Yokosuka B-4Y dive bombers released their 100 bombs, which came whistling down onto the Panay. One scored a direct hit on the pilot house, severely wounding Commander Hughes and knocking out the ship's steering, radio, sickbay, 3-inch guns, and electrical system. Now in command, Lieutenant Anders ordered the crew to return fire, as 6 more dive bombers came screaming down and 9 Nakajima A-4N fighters began strafing the ships. Sailors scrambled from their cabin to man the 8 Lewis guns on the upper deck. Among them was Chief Boatswain Mate Ernest Malman, who was in the shower when the bombs started falling and rushed onto the deck dressed only in a shirt. This incident appeared in newsreel footage shot by Universal Newsreel cameraman Norman Alley, immortalizing Malman as the pantsless gunner of the Panay. Lieutenant Anders also manned one of the guns, but was soon struck in the hands and throat by shrapnel from an exploding bomb. In total, 5 bombs struck the Panay in 30 minutes, and by 2 p.m., she had begun to list and take on water. The 3 Standard Oil tankers had also been hit and were engulfed in a sea of flames. Unable to speak and with blood dripping from his throat, Lieutenant Anders scrawled out his orders on a nautical chart: "Abandon ship." The wounded, including Commander Hughes, were transferred to the Panay's motor launch and ferried ashore. It was a fraught evacuation, with the Japanese aircraft continuing to bomb the launch as it darted between the ship and the shore. But while the boat suffered numerous bullet holes and began taking on water, the crew did manage to evacuate the Panay with no further loss of life. Concealed in a patch of reeds in the riverbank, the survivors watched as a group of Japanese soldiers approached the Panay in a motorboat and boarded her, likely searching for codebooks and other intelligence. Finding nothing, they soon departed. 2 hours later, the USS Panay finally slipped beneath the muddy waters of the Yangtze. The attack on the Panay claimed 4 lives: storekeeper First Class Charles Ensminger, coxswain Edgar Holzbus, Standard Oil tanker captain Carl H. Carlson, and Italian journalist Sandro Sandri. An unknown number of Chinese sailors and refugees also perished aboard the 3 tankers. Of the 54 survivors from the Panay, 43 sailors and 5 civilians were wounded, 16 so severely that they could not move on their own. The group now faced a fateful choice: stay put and wait for rescue, or risk the 13-kilometer journey to the nearby Chinese-held village of Hoshin. Concluding that the Japanese were likely looking to execute anyone who had witnessed the attack, the group improvised stretches for the wounded and started off towards Hoshin. As for Norman Alley, fearing his precious newsreel footage would be confiscated and destroyed, he wrapped the film in a sack and buried it in the mud. And so it was, cold, wet, and exhausted, with no food, it took the survivors an entire day to reach the village, where a missionary relayed news of their arrival to Nelson T. Johnson, the American ambassador to China. Finally, on December the 14th, 1937, the survivors were rescued by the Panay's sister ship, the USS Oahu, and the British gunboats HMS Ladybird and Bee. Though the attack had been horrific, it paled in comparison to the fate that befell the residents and defenders of Nanking. On December the 13th, Japanese forces finally broke through the city's defenses. Enraged by their setbacks at the Battle of Shanghai, Japanese troops embarked on an orgy of brutality and depravity unparalleled in modern history, raping, torturing, and slaughtering an estimated 200,000 Chinese soldiers and civilians in a massacre today known as the Rape of Nanking. As for the United States, news of the Panay's sinking ignited a political firestorm, raising the specter of war with Japan. Recalling the explosion of the USS Maine, which had triggered the Spanish-American War, U.S. Ambassador to Japan Joseph Grew warned the Japanese, "We must not forget history. Neither the American government nor the American people had wanted war with Spain in 1898, but when the Maine was blown up, nothing could prevent war." But the mood in the United States was nowhere near as bloodthirsty. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, much of Congress and the American public had maintained a firm isolationist stance, not wishing to be drawn into another foreign conflict. By contrast, the State Department and the Navy had pursued a more internationalist agenda, pushing for greater involvement in foreign affairs. As a result of this infighting, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt faced an enormous challenge in trying to negotiate this explosive crisis. Japanese officials, including Imperial Japanese Navy Commander Masatake Okomiya, who had led the dive bombers during the attack, maintained that the sinking was a tragic mistake and that the Japanese pilots had mistaken the Panay and its accompanying oil tankers as Chinese troop ships. However, several pieces of evidence contradicted this claim. The weather on December the 12th had been bright and clear, and Norman Alley's newsreel footage clearly showed Japanese aircraft attacking the Panay at near-deck height, making it highly improbable that the pilots had not seen the large American flags displayed on her decks. Nonetheless, the strong isolationist lobby within the American government made Roosevelt highly reluctant to go to war, and he ordered the 30 frames showing the low-level attacks cut from Alley's footage before it could be shown in movie theaters. Even Secretary Hull was forced to admit, America is in no position to send sufficient naval forces to Japanese and Chinese waters to require the Japanese to make the fullest amends and resume something of law-abiding course in the future. And so it was that after 2 weeks of tense negotiation and diplomacy, the Japanese government agreed to take full responsibility for the incident, though they continued to maintain that the attack had been unintentional. Vice Admiral Rokuzo Sugiyama, Chief of Staff of the Japanese forces in northern China, was assigned to present the official apology, which reached Washington on Christmas Eve of 1937. In addition, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Vice Minister of the Navy and later architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, relieved Rear Admiral Teizo Mitsunami, commanding officer of naval air forces in the Shanghai region, of command. Japan's Navy Minister also extended the apologies of every member of the Japanese Navy and announced that the Imperial Navy would render a salute to honor the victims of the Panay. 4 months later, in April of 1938, the Japanese paid an indemnity of $2,214,007.36 to the United States. The Panay crisis was officially over. Reflecting on the incident, Secretary Hull recalled, "On this side, our people generally took the incident calmly. There were a few demands that the fleet should be sent at once to the Orient. There were many more demands that we should withdraw completely from China. It was a serious incident, but unless we could have proven the complicity of the Japanese government itself, it was not an occasion for war." Today, it's generally agreed that the attack on the Panay was likely intentional, with historians pointing to decrypted Japanese Navy radio messages ordering the dive bombers to attack. These messages were not made public at the time, as they would have revealed the US's penetration of Japanese naval codes. What is less clear is who ordered the attack and why, with the leading theory being that it was carried out without government authorization by a radical faction of the Japanese military. But whether the attack was intended to test the US's resolve in supporting China or provoking an all-out war, we will likely never know. What is known is that the incident, and the world's muted response to the Sino-Japanese War as a whole, likely emboldened the Japanese to further pursue their territorial ambitions. The United States had thus not avoided war, but merely delayed it, a fact which would become abundantly clear when, nearly 4 years to the day after the Panay incident, swarms of Japanese planes appeared in the skies over Hawaii. And for more on why the Japanese chose to attack the US at Pearl Harbor, even though they knew they'd handily lose a war with the US, do go check out our recent video on our sister channel, Today I Found Out, Why Did the Japanese Join the Non-Aryan Hating Nazis?